I don't know what's wrong with me, but I find myself constantly reading the most inane material. I think that's why I got a third at university. When I got my third, I said to my tutor, was I close to a 2-2? He said, no, Rico, it's a very solid third. So I knew then that ordination into the Church of England was the only career option available, but I kept up these hopeless reading habits. And here's something I was reading recently. I hope you spend your reading time more profitably than me, but here's something. It's a list of lost property that was handed in at British Rail depots, and at the top of the list, to my astonishment, was a human brain that was apparently left by a medical student on a train during an away day. I don't know what you'd call that, but I think it would probably be the ultimate in absent-mindedness, I'm not sure. The other things left on the train included a pair of stuffed gerbils, a glass eye, a motorcycle and a wooden leg, and the mind boggles as to whether the same person left them all on the train. Anyway, by contrast this Friday evening, and thank you for joining us, I'd like you to use your minds, and I wonder if you could do a small exercise with me. Here it is. Henry Ford said, thinking is probably the hardest work there is, which is the probable reason why so few of us engage in it. But could you put your mind to this question this Friday night? Here it is. Do you think you're a successful person? And I don't really mean have you been in the past, or do you think you will be? But right now, would you consider yourself successful? And I guess as we grapple with that, there'd be some people who'd say, look, with all modesty, I think I am. There'd be some who've been put down so often their confidence is rock bottom. Most of us would be mucking around in the middle. My older brother was head boy and captain of everything. I remember I nearly put on my UCAS form when I applied to university that I was his brother. But I mean, where would you be on that? Well, what's interesting is there comes before us a guy in the passage today who from every perspective would have been considered successful. But was he? As we look at him, you see, what would constitute success as far as you're concerned? And this guy, here we are in Luke's Gospel, would have been considered successful, and yet God, as he looks at him, calls him a dismal failure. So in this passage, Luke 12 and verse 13, in this little parable that Jesus teaches, which is a story with a spiritual cutting edge, this man is called a fool. It's extraordinary, isn't it? You fool. That's the epitaph that God writes for him. This is the funeral card of my best mate from university. He died in 2005, so 16 years ago now, and I took his funeral. And I went to his grave with his dad, who actually I took his dad's funeral 4 years ago, but I went to his grave with his dad in about 2006. And his father was crying, and he looked at his son's grave, and they hadn't yet put the epitaph on, and he said, Rico, what epitaph do I put on my son's grave? Gosh, it was a chilling moment. It was so sad. But God writes the epitaph for this man, you fool. And the word here, fool, means without thinking. It's not that he didn't think, he did, but he didn't think about the right things. He didn't think about the really important things. So his mind time was absolutely packed with stuff. He had no more bandwidth, but he hadn't thought about, according to his Creator, the really important things in life. So I wonder if we can just give our minds to that. What constitutes success in life and failure in life according to this passage? Now, interestingly, and this is so striking for COVID, because in COVID, death has gone from being a taboo subject to a reality. There's now a death salience, a death wisdom, the experts call it. People, are adjusting to its reality because of the figures on the news each night. But in this passage, Jesus has been talking in Luke chapter 12 about eternity. So this biography of Jesus, he's been talking about eternity, and people are riveted because the Bible says God has put eternity into our hearts. And in a sense, coming to faith is a bit like waking up. I came to faith in 1982 when my godfather was killed in a cliff fall on the 6th of August. What I mean by that is I suddenly woke up and it was like, death is real. And that's why the pandemic over the last year has been chilling for me in a way, because it's that same feeling that I had 40 years ago. It's that sense of waking up, gosh, the reality of it. Well, Jesus is speaking about eternity. People have woken up to the brevity of life, and he's talking, and verse 5 of Luke chapter 12, this biography of Jesus written by a doctor, fear him who after the killing of the body has thrown you, can throw you into hell. Gosh, what's that saying? Verse 2, there's nothing concealed that won't be disclosed. Verse 8, eternity belongs to this figure, the Son of Man. And then into all that, bang, there's suddenly an interruption, a massive interruption, and a guy in the crowd says, will you shut up about this super spiritual stuff? That doesn't put bread on the table. That's not reality. And then he just says, tell my brother, my wretched brother, to divide the inheritance with me. Let me read it to you. Verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Of course, it doesn't say wretched, I put that in, but that's what he means. Because here are two brothers, and they're falling out over who's going to get Granny's sideboard and clock. I had a friend, another clergyman, who took a funeral, and during the funeral, one of the members of the family removed from the parental home what they wanted, got a removal van when everyone was out, and took what they wanted. They literally came back for the wake, and there was no dining room table. Can I advise you not to do that? It puts a bit of a shadow over Christmas. Anyway, this man is absorbed with possessions. He can't be done with Jesus' teaching, and so Jesus, after the man has said divide the inheritance, said, watch out, verse 15, be on guard against all kinds of greed. And the word watch out is get out the way, because a truck's about to hit you. It's what you shout, watch out the way. And then he arrests us with this parable that's designed to make this very angry relative, older or younger brother, actually think about whether he's actually going to go to court and serve a writ against his own brother. And some of you listening to this will know what I mean. You know what they say about a will, don't they? Wherever there's a will, there's a family. Well, that's what's happening here. They're falling out for good. And Jesus, a rabbi, says, let's think about what's important. So he says, verse 16, the ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. So this guy knew when the EU subsidies happened exactly how to play them. The stables have been converted. I don't know, there are 4 cars outside. He probably, I don't know, comes up from Talbot Woods in Sandbanks. Maybe he's there through the week or the weekend, but he'll be part of a hedge fund, I guess, on Bond Street in the West End. His wife up in London will shop at Harrods and Harvey Nicks, I guess. And I guess, John Lewis or Waitrose will be where they are at the weekend. Where would they send their schools in your area, to their kids to school in your area? I don't know, Castle Court and Camford, I guess. I'm not sure. Be a member of Parkstone Golf Club. That's how it would work, wouldn't it? By the way, welcome if you're those things. And if you saw him commuting up to London on a Monday morning from Sandbanks, and you saw him heading up towards the city, you'd nudge your neighbour and say, look at him, as you walk past the first class. He made a fortune. Do you know 2007-8, when everyone was losing everything in that recession, he made money. He's no fool. Look at him. Verse 17 and 18. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Verse 18. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I'll store all my grain and my goods. You see, he gets a better harvest than is expected one year. There's no panic. There's no waste. He's not going to flood the market. He gets out his calculator. He works out what to do. He works out it's definitely worth paying for a massive grain storage mountain. Waste not, want not. That's what his mum taught him. So he's got a bigger profit, and he's not going to let Rishi Sunak get hold of it. He's not going to let the tax man get it. And he calls in his accountant, and he works out how to invest it. And then, having planned and worked and thought and planned and worked and thought and absolutely given his mind time to it, it's amazing, because at 47 he's able to say to himself, verse 19, it's a wonderful moment, verse 19, I'll say to myself, you've plenty of grain laid up for many years, take life easy, eat, drink and be merry. And doubtless at that point, even in the midst of a pandemic, the Sunday Times magazine would do an article on him entitled "The Man Who Knew When to Stop." And we read about him, and we read that he's now, obviously a member of Parkstone Golf Club, but he's, probably a member of Royal St George's down on the Kent coast as well, just enjoying playing that sort of coastal golf. He intends to get down to single figures at both, and he's got a wonderful house in Talbot Woods, and there's a great party down, and all the city friends have come down one weekend to celebrate his retirement. And after they've gone back, he's standing on the veranda and he's looking out at the sea, and he's got a long cool glass of, what do you think, orange juice in his hands. And he says to himself, as he looks down at the side table and he sees the magazines and he sees the chalet that they're going to get, so then they can go when the best snow's on, so they're not going to have to worry about timeshare. And Val d'Isere or Marbella or Verbier, he doesn't know where he's going to go, Aspen perhaps. And he suddenly says to himself, as he looks down there and there are safaris he's going to go on, and he suddenly says to himself, "You've done it. You've done it. Ever since you were 15 years old, you dreamed of having this sort of wealth, and now you've done it. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." And he has a heart attack, and he's dead before they get him to intensive care. Suddenly there's this searing pain in his chest, and he's gone. And of course, with COVID, even with people who are young and fit, we've lost one or two like that. Desperate. So here we go with this story. And what does God say to him? Verse 20. He says, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you." So what do they do now? Well, they hold a memorial service for him. He's got a yacht. Perhaps the ashes are thrown over the side of the yacht down in Sandbanks. And doubtless at the funeral, they'll talk about what a loyal servant of the company he was. The trade journal will say what an example he was to his profession. But I say again, when it comes to what does it mean to be successful, God says to him, "You fool." Do you know, I took a funeral of a young woman, Kathy, who'd been killed agonizingly in a car crash many years ago. It was desperate to take it. But after the funeral, there was a granny there, and she said to me, "Rico, what's failure?" And I looked at her. She said, "What's failure?" I said, "I don't know what you mean." She said, "Failure is being successful at the things that don't matter." And at that moment, there I was taking a funeral. I understood what she meant. Because as we come to this guy, we've got to ask, what about the eternal world? How successful was he in terms of the eternal world? Because what we learn in this passage, that eternally all was lost. Verse 21, "This is how it'll be with anyone who stores up things for themselves but is not rich towards God." Now, I don't know about that story, but do you reckon it might have helped one of the brothers put the writ in his pocket, back in his pocket, and think, well, I'll just think about it, I'll stop, I'll think about what's important, what really matters in life? I think it would have made him think about it. And this guy made two mistakes. There are two mistakes. And this Friday evening in Bournemouth, can I just offer them to you to be chatted about? The first mistake he made in terms of what it means to constitute success in life is that he lived as though God was not there. And we don't know much about this guy. We don't know if he was a good husband or a philanderer. We don't know if he was a good, kind father or he thrashed his children. All we know is the end of verse 21 was that he was not rich towards God. Now, I would imagine that if you'd have stopped him with a vox pop and he looked out from Sandbanks and you said, "Look, do you believe in God?" He'd have said, "Gosh, look at the sun going down. Look at the sea. Look at the beauty of the coast. Yeah, I believe in God." But he lived as though God wasn't there. He wasn't so much COV, Church of England, but C&E, Christmas and Easter. And actually, where was everything focused? In this passage, we learn that it was focused in on himself. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. There I'll store all my grain and my goods, and I'll say to myself." He thought he was self-sufficient. Actually, he was self-centered. Samuel Butler wrote about two incredibly selfish people, Mr. and Mrs. Carlyle. He said this, How good of God to cause Carlyle and Mrs. Carlyle to marry one another and make 2 people miserable instead of 4, because self-centered people are such a pain, aren't they? And this guy was focused in on himself. And, you know, he's got everything he wants: treasure, plenty of good things; leisure, take life easy; pleasure, eat, drink, and be merry. But God, the giver of those things, well, God was on the back burner. He wasn't going to be bothering about God at the moment. There were other things to be doing. My dad has died now, but he was a business guy. He worked in a multinational. And he said to me towards the end of his life, as he became a Christian in his mid-70s, he said, "You know, the thing that's most struck me is a verse that you showed me, Rico." I showed him a verse as a sort of, I don't know, a bit of an arrogant son. I mean, he was a lovely dad, but Christian faith wasn't really a reality until his 70s. But I showed him this verse in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 16 and 17. That's in the Old Testament. And it's Moses addressing the people of God before they enter the promised land in the story of Israel. And he says this: "You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But as you go into the promised land, remember the Lord your God. It's he who gives you the ability to produce wealth." So that gift of making money was a gift. But he took the gift and he forgot the giver. And what was he meant to do with his money? Well, it was great. Make as much as you can, but he was meant to be generous. But this guy just forgot about God, thought it was all down to me. And it was madness. Why is that? Because God is there and he's revealed himself to us. You know, he lived as though God wasn't there, but God is. He sends his son and he says, "What do you make of my son?" So this is the heart of the Christian faith. We're saying the reason it's not successful to live without reference to God is that God, as he sends Jesus, has made it perfectly plain that he wants us to relate to him. He sends Jesus, who walks off the pages of Scripture, who dies on Good Friday, who rises on Easter Day, so that we can know him. And in fact, Jesus is meant to be as central to life as a ball is to a game. Imagine a rugby match kicking off and there's no ball. They're just going through the motions. The Bible, as it speaks of Jesus, says, well, this God's Son is meant to be as central as that. And yet here's a guy who lives as though God isn't there. And God says, well, what do you think of my son, who flattened a storm, who raised a dead girl? So the Bible is about Jesus, and it says, what does it mean to be in relationship with him? He has spoken about his son. And what we're saying is, that's the heart of success, because eternity is eternity. And if we want to get to eternity, what do we have to do? We have to see the gateway to that is the cross. So he doesn't just send his son to meet us, Jesus Christ. He also sends his son to die to forgive us. When Jesus dies on the cross, he dies in our place for our wrongdoing, and he pays in death and blood for all that we've done wrong. Many years ago, when I was at Bristol University, I played rugby against a club side called Dings Crusaders. And I arrived at the Dings ground, I saw my opposite number, who had a number 3 on his back, and my trepidation was massively increased when I just saw the size of him. He was enormous, but he wasn't warming up at all. I thought, well, I wonder why that is. And I looked round, and he had a tiny baby boy in his arms. I mean, he just was massive, but there was this little boy. Just before kick-off, he handed this boy across. He walked onto the field. He ripped me limb from limb. Half-time went straight back to the baby boy. Second half came back on, threw me around like straw in the wind. As the final whistle went, that baby boy was back in the man's arms. There was no question who the father was. There was no question who the son was. I'd like to have seen anyone lay a finger on that little kid. It would have been amusing to behold the result. Do you think God loved his son, Jesus Christ, any less than that man loved his little boy, yet he sent him to die so that I could be forgiven? And this man lives as though there's no God, and God says, you're a fool. Secondly, as we finish, he doesn't just live as though there's no God, he also lives as though there's no judgment. Verse 20, but God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then you'll get what you prepared for yourself. Yeah. This guy had a framework for living, and it didn't include eternity. And life is so short. Oh, I've taken so many COVID funerals, over 10. And you know, you stand at the graveside with so few mourners, and you say these words from Psalm 103. As for man, his days are like grass. He flourishes like a flower of the field. The wind blows its place and remembers it no more. We do flourish. In Bournemouth this summer, we'll see so many people flourishing. But it's over so quickly. And what about eternity? And surely COVID has made us ask that. And this guy lives as though there's no judgment. As though there's no day when God will say to us, Rico, did you know me? And what about your wrongdoing? Did you have it forgiven? So all the times you've taken the gifts of God, fun, family, friends, falling in love, food, fitness, they're wonderful, these gifts, but you've ignored the giver. And God says, well, where were we? And then, what have you done with my son? I sent him, and he was meant to be as central to life as a ball is to a game, but again you ignored him. And you ignored his death on the cross. And someone would say, well, I didn't think it mattered. I thought my goodness was good enough. If your goodness was good enough, why did God send his son to die? Surely the death of Jesus tells me that there's a problem with my sin. That's the word for rebelling against God, and I need to be forgiven. And God sends his son to die so that I can be forgiven. So let me close there. I'm sure there'll be questions for the Q&A, but here's a man who everyone would consider successful, and God says he's been a fool. Why? Because he lives as though there's no God and no judgment, and God has sent his son Jesus so that we'll know God. So what do you make of Jesus? And also, to what degree is success in life actually based upon how I relate to Jesus, who, well, at the very least gets me through to eternity, if the resurrection can be trusted? And what do you think of Christ's resurrection from the dead? If he got through death then, he can get me through. Lots of questions. I hope we can have a bit of a Q&A now. I know we're going to be doing that. But it was a striking thing that Granny said to me, wasn't it, at the funeral? Failure is being successful at the things that don't matter. And I can tell you, as I hold my best friend from university's funeral card, I can see the poignancy of that word. Thanks so much for listening. Let's head into the Q&A.